Hello and welcome to The Booking Club with me, Jack Aldain, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. This episode's guest is Sathnam Sanghera, and on the menu we have the global legacy of the British Empire, how it has shaped the globe, what it has done to our taste buds, and more.
I once wrote a column explaining why Pizza Express was the greatest restaurant in the world.
I read it.
It's followed me around my whole life. And almost immediately after I wrote it, Pizza Express became quite bad. But it's now got better again. But I love the fact that you know the menu already, so there's no faffing around. There's always something kicking off. There's always someone breaking up. Some kid having a tantrum. So it doesn't matter what happens. So it doesn't matter you arrived with a podcast kit. It's like you cannot make a scene in Pizza Express because there's always something happening. And also you know what you're going to get. And it's always okay. And there's a lot to be said for that.
So we have front-loaded this episode with why the guest you just heard has chosen this as his favourite restaurant in which to talk about his latest book. Need I introduce him? His name is Sathnam Sanghera, and he is the author of Empireland and its sequel, Empireworld. Welcome, Sathnam, and thank you very much for choosing Pizza Express. Only you and another guest have chosen Pizza Express. The other guest was Sam Leith. So do you know the connection between Sam Leith
and Pizza Express?
I know, yeah.
No.
Sam Leith has a family connection to the invention of Pizza Express's garlic bread. I
just like it.
Yeah.
That makes me more pathetic.
But you've also written in the Times about it.
Yeah, I've changed my views. In my 20s, I won this award for journalism. And my employer, the FT at the time, said, "Oh, congratulations! Please take your spouse out for dinner on us." So I found the most expensive restaurant I could. I went to the Gavroche, and I ordered every expensive thing, and it was like a £600 bill.
The Gavroche.
And the day afterwards, I was sat next to someone else who had won an award, and I said, "Oh, where did you take your wife?" And he was like, "Oh, we went to Pizza Express." £40, and I realised I'd slightly not taken it in the spirit of things. They still paid, though.
The book Empireworld is a sequel, as I mentioned, and like all sequels, it indicates unfinished business. It probably helps us understand what makes Empireworld an act of finishing what you started if we go back to where you started with this. Let's talk a little bit first about Empireland. What were you trying to achieve with Empireland, and what made you think, actually, there is a second book that I need to write in order to complete this?
Well, Empireland was accidentally written. I didn't really mean to write it. And it was focused on how the British Empire shaped Britain. And I think it's a great introduction to the subject. Because I was taking readers with me, because I didn't know anything about it, and readers didn't know anything about it, and we both learned stuff. But I realised about a year into the publicity and doing things like this, is that there were a bunch of things I didn't have the answer to. People kept on saying things like, "Oh, well, the British Empire introduced the rule of law to the world," or the British Empire caused massive geopolitical chaos across the world. And I would kind of mumble. I didn't really know the answer. So I realized that there was a gap in my knowledge, and actually I need to think about all the ways in which the British Empire shaped the world. And actually that has been the focus of most of the big books on empire, like Neil Ferguson's book, Jeremy Paxman's book, Jan Morris's book. That has generally been the gist. So I felt there was a journey I had to go on. I hadn't quite completed the journey anyway.
Right. As you say in the book, we can't understand the modern world unless we understand the British Empire. Why so? Aren't there other empires that help us understand the world better today? Doesn't the American Empire really give us our understanding of the modern world?
Oh gosh, yeah, we could talk about that. Come back to that.
Okay.
I would say, yes, other empires are really important, and there are ongoing empires, but the British Empire was the biggest in history. The biggest empire ever. It's the biggest thing we ever did as a country, and we don't talk about it much. But it explains so much about our daily lives. There's someone over there on that table having a gin and tonic, and that's a drink. Quinine, comes from Cinchona, and the British Empire was massively into that plant and helped develop that as a crop and thereby enable the colonization of West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
To understand our daily lives, like our consumption of tea, tax avoidance, you need to understand the British Empire. Also, if you want to understand the news, you need to understand the British Empire. If you want to understand the background to Israel-Palestine, you need to understand the history. If you want to understand Donald Trump and what he's doing with America at the moment, he wants to invade Greenland, wants to invade possibly Canada, wants to take over the Panama Canal, wants to send Native Americans, or deprive them of their citizenship. You know, it wants to basically do what the British Empire was doing in the 19th century. And if you want to understand what it's doing, if you want to understand the power of tech companies, you need to understand the East India Company. And so I think this is central to understanding the modern world.
The introduction of the book makes the point that empires don't shape the world around them merely by creating or destroying things, but by transforming them so thoroughly that it becomes exceptionally difficult to judge whether they did more good than harm or vice versa. This is the effect of creating chaos in the world.
Yeah, it's a bit like trying to take the yeast out of your pizza that's about to arrive, you know? Or is there yeast in pizza? Yes, there is.
Yeah. Or the example you give is what ghee in a masala omelette.
Yes, I was trying to be appropriate for the setting.
Yeah.
It's so inbred, and people talk about decolonizing the world. Okay, if you want to decolonize the world, you're going to have to get rid of Nigeria, which was created out as a result of the British Empire, Pakistan. You're going to have to... Indians are going to have to stop drinking tea. Indians are going to have to stop playing cricket. You have to rename half the world, but a whole hundreds of thousands of places which are named after Queen Victoria, King James. You're going to have to stop a load of people practicing Christianity, speaking English. You can't really do it.
And our food has already arrived. So, what do we have in front of us here? Chicken Caesar salad for Sathnam, and for myself, the badana.
I used to look down on people who didn't order pizza at Pizza Express, but health needs kick in.
In your column about Pizza Express, you mentioned the fact that Brits love adequacy from their food. Just good enough that they can part ways with money for it and know what they're getting each time. Which feels like it's a terrible irony that this country went around the world taking so much from so many parts, seemingly in an experimental frenzy. And in the end, this is still a nation of people who want things to be very simple.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, actually less than pizza, probably chicken tikka masala is a symbol of that, in that you had all the sophisticated cuisine of India, you know, so much variation, so much subtlety in the dishes, and you just plaster one word onto it, curry, calling all this food curry, and then you make a bastardized, Indian immigrants make, or South Asian immigrants, make a bastardized version of it called curry, called chicken tikka masala. Quite bland, but also, it's okay. I don't mind it. It's fine. It's as an introduction to Indian food. But the word curry was applied in this mindless way to this cuisine, which was so much more sophisticated than... And this is pretty much the way the British dealt with India, in that they went there and they applied their quite basic preconceptions onto the Indians. And that continues to be the way in which they see India and also the empire. You know, it's all quite basic.
Where are your parents originally from, Sathnam?
They're from the Punjab in the north of India. So they're Sikh. So the Sikhs did quite well, I guess, relatively from the empire, because they were fetishized by the British as a martial race. And we weren't alone. Loads of people were fetishized. Certain groups in Nigeria, the Highlanders in Scotland.
Yeah, all peoples who helped the British militarily.
Yeah, the Nepalese, the Gurkhas, and it's such a powerful idea. These are basically racist ideas, but they were quite flattering in some cases. They're so powerful that the Gurkhas still see themselves through that prism. The Sikhs do. Sikhs still see themselves as a warrior race, and that was an idea partly created by the Sikh gurus, but supercharged by the British. And so now Sikhs see that's how powerful the racism of the 19th century British Empire was, that these ideas persist. Also the idea that, you know, black people are lazy. This is a racist idea born out of slavery, that black people won't work unless they're compelled. And surveys show that this idea persists. You know, a lot of people in Britain still believe this, and it just reminds us on how actually when racism emerged, scientific racism emerged in the 19th century, it had a distinctly British flavour. The British were involved in it, although we don't like to think about it.
I'd like to talk about your relationship to empire and food, given that we're on the subject of your upbringing. Tell us about the food, the home cooking that you grew up with.
Yeah, I mean, food's a good way to look at the empire in general.
Yeah.
But actually, I mean, this Punjabi food, you'd recognise it because it's become the stuff that's served in Indian restaurants. So you'd know what a samosa is, you know what saag is, you would know keema maybe, which is a mince. This is Punjabi food, but the stuff you're getting in British restaurants is often cooked by people from another part of India. And it's cooked for a British palate. So I vaguely recognize it, but also it's nothing like I remember eating as a kid. But it's a reflection of the British Empire, and that you've got multiple different groups in Britain who are here all because of the British Empire, who are catering for the British palate. But the food and tea and drink and rum, which came out of Barbados, food and drink are a great way to look at the British Empire. And I did a Radio 4 series about the history of tea, and it captures so much. It captures the loss of American colonies because of the Boston Tea Party. It captures the Opium Wars because that's what East India Company started selling opium to the Chinese in exchange for tea. It captures indentured labour. It captures almost the entire history of the British Empire, good and bad.
What did you grow up eating then?
We would have Indian food at lunchtime. I came home from school. I'd have it at lunchtime and dinner time, but it'd always be slightly bastardized with English stuff. So I remember I would have lentil dal, yellow dal with ketchup sometimes. I'd sometimes pour Indian tea onto Weetabix.
No, really? As for breakfast?
Yeah, we slightly tandoori the turkey at Christmas.
Wow.
A lot of Indian, and also there's something called Dorka beans. Don't know if you heard of them. Every Indian will know what I mean by this. It's slightly curried beans, fake beans. It's a very quick thing to do. You can do it in 10-15 minutes.
It's so funny because everything you're describing, perhaps with the exception of the tea on Weetabix, I think is something that Brits would absolutely leap at now.
Yeah,
tandoori turkey
at
Christmas, baked beans with those curry spices in them. I mean,
it takes us back to the origins of the empire. Why did empire start? It started for lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons that the Dutch and the English were so obsessed with spices because it made food taste better. It's often said, English food was really bland until the British Empire. I don't think that's simple because actually the Indian cuisine and the British cuisine in the Tudor times was quite similar. It's all quite stews. A lot of these spices actually came from Latin America, and potatoes and tomatoes. It was, the Columbian exchange. This is an international imperial project that led to food around the world changing. I think when people talk about cultural appropriation and how it's bad, it annoys me because I think all culture is appropriation. All food is appropriation. You can do it well, though, and you can do it badly.
A lot of people experience a certain anxiety around spices in the home or indeed in the supermarket. I mean, there's such a variety, and we know how certain spices do not go together particularly well. There seems to be this bit of a disconnect between the history of spice importation in this country and the fact that most people still have a real fondness, as your article about Pizza Express alludes to blandness, to texture over flavour.
The thing is, I've got that side to me. I'm from the Midlands, so I love a pie.
Yeah.
Love a Greg's pie, love a chicken pie. I like fish and chips, but fish and chips themselves have an immigrant background. I think British people actually have London anyway has a quite sophisticated taste now.
That's why I do this podcast. Sometimes it's tempting to think about countries as though they were people and to talk about them as such. If post-imperial Britain was a person, what sort of person would it be? Specifically, what sort of therapy do you think that person would need?
I actually think the analogy between people and a country is quite a good one because people are opposites. Whatever you say about someone, the opposite is true to a certain degree. I'm a massive introvert, but I don't mind doing public things. I quite enjoy it, occasionally. Whatever I could say about you, I bet your opposite is true to a certain degree. And the same is definitely true about the history of the British Empire, in that it involved slavery, but it involved anti-slavery, it involved the free press, it involved press censorship, it involved geopolitical chaos, it involved the installation of democracy. It's a bunch of contradictions. So I think the people analogy is quite a good one. But in terms of Britain, as a person, I think therapy is a very good thing, another good analogy, because Britain is a country that's refusing to have therapy. So its history comes out in really dysfunction, in the form of dysfunction, in the way it does with a person, right? So one of the dysfunctions is Brexit. You know, this obsession with being independent, not being part of a club. It's all about the empire. Well, it's partly about the empire. You know, it's about the fact that we ran a quarter of the world. When we joined the EU, it felt like a demotion. And so when Brexit happened, you know, people like Farage talking about Independence Day, talking about Britain being a world beater, this obsession with being the greatest, which even Keir Starmer, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, all of these people, even left-wing people, go on about being the greatest. What goes back to empire? We ran a quarter of the planet. That's going to shape your psyche. Everything afterwards is going to feel like a trauma. But we've never sat down and ever really talked about it. And I think it's reflected partly not only in the fact that we only ever really teach the world wars and the Tudors properly, it's reflected in our films. Because think about all the films we have on World War II, World War I, the Tudors, millions of them, hundreds of them. Hardly any films about the biggest thing we ever did. There's Zulu. Honestly, I couldn't name you more than 5 films about the British Empire.
It would be a long film.
But even bits of it, why not? There's bits of films you could do.
Yeah, it's true. I can't name them off the top of my head, at least not ones that deal with the story of World War II, and particularly the story of Churchill's leadership has served as a placeholder for everything that we think matters about who we are. You know, we had this man who was himself an imperialist, who got us through the darkest time, and without whom things would have gotten pretty scary for us.
Yeah, and even those films about World War I and World War II very rarely mention the millions of soldiers who'd fought from Empire. I don't think we would have won either war without the help of the Empire. I think a lot of the politicians involved said that. But English Patient has the Sikh soldiers. Lawrence Fox became famous by objecting to the inclusion of a Sikh soldier in a World War I film. And guess what? Sikhs were there. But it was such a problematic thing for him that he started complaining about it. But and even in the Tudor times, I mean, there were black people in Henry VIII's court, in Henry VII's court. There's famously a black trumpeter. Elizabeth I was complaining about there being too many black people in London in 1600. But that is not reflected in our movies, books about that time.
So again, to extend that person nation state analogy, Britain is clearly wandering around right now in a monologue, singing old tunes to comfort itself, and doesn't want to talk to anybody about what happened. You know, we flipped a few tables on the 23rd of June 2016, made a horrendous mess, and even that we're still coming to terms with. If Britain were a patient, what would you, Sathnam Sanghera, the therapist, start that conversation?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would say, we'll try and make the patient understand that this is not about their feelings. Because when you mention empire, a lot of feelings come up. Whether you a child of someone who is colonized or you're on the side of the colonizers, feelings of pride and shame, embarrassment come up. I would say it's got nothing to do with you. You were not to blame for any of this.
Important message there.
Yeah,
you are not to blame.
You're not to blame for slavery. You're not to blame for the Indian Jallianwala Bagh massacre. It's got nothing to do with your feelings. And it's not a personal thing. It's an intellectual thing. You just need to understand it.
Do you think a lot of the anti-colonialism has been largely to do with this feeling of being blamed for something that you weren't a part of?
Totally. And also a lot of people have family who were involved in empire. And the moment they hear the mention of slavery or the counter-narrative, they're like, are you saying my great-grandfather was a racist, white supremacist? Are you saying that he was responsible for a genocide? I'm not saying that. Empire was complicated. They were good imperialists. Absolutely. I mentioned some of them in Empireworld. Virginia Woolf's grandfather is an amazing man. George Orwell, a man who had an imperial role and then became very anti-imperial. William Gladstone, whose father made a fortune from slavery, but then who railed against empire. It's complicated. People were complicated. And so don't be black and white about it, and don't reduce it to feeling. It's complex, and it's not about you. That's what I would say in the first 10 sessions of therapy.
Yeah, whether that would fulfill the role of a therapist or somebody who was sent in as an interventionist, I think is up for debate. But I think you're absolutely right in everything you said.
Actually, I was thinking about my. I wrote a memoir called The Boy with the Top Knot 15 years ago. Discovered all sorts of horrible things about my family. Wrote about them. Did I do that because I hate my family? No, I did it because I love them. And it's the same with history. You can explore your country's history and discover dark things and still love your country. It's because I love it. It's because you love your country that you're taking the time to learn about it, warts and all.
I think the British pride themselves, among other things, on an image of being unsusceptible to fantasy, to being based in common sense and empiricism, and not swept away by mythologies the way that their American cousins are about national pride. Do you remember the opening ceremony to the 2012 Olympics? I remember thinking that was a really telling display, because so much of it, aside from being to do with, pop cultural figures from Arctic Monkeys to Mr. Bean, also had this slight sort of fairy tale delirium to it. We are a country that has always lived and died by our delusions. Whatever is going on in the real world, there's an England that exists up here in
every
most
country's like this. Why has Russia invaded Ukraine? It's imperial nostalgia. The Russian Empire. Why does Donald Trump want to rename the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and take over Greenland and, push the Native Americans out of their reservations?
True, but in the case of Russia, there you have Putin making that decision with Brexit. That was a country taking that decision based on an idea it had about itself that it felt it had to recapture. Stories about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going are essential to all countries. You have to have a sense of what the future holds, and you have to have that be based on a sense of who you are now. And if that is based on who you were, then we've got a lot of work to do.
Obviously, there's a huge backlash to this new history, but when you look at the surveys of British people are quite into this. I mean, something like 74% of British people think it's a good idea to teach kids about slavery and colonialism. 44% of them think the royal family should pay reparations for slavery, which I thought was a very high figure, given no one really knew the royals were involved in slavery until 2 years ago. But there's a huge backlash against this on social media, in party politics. And how real is that? I think there's two different things. There's Britain, and then there's politics. Three worlds. Then there's social media. You mustn't confuse the three things. I would say the movement amongst the British public of my lifetime has been towards greater understanding. You've got to understand that the counter-narrative to the imperial story it's only about 15 years old, 10, 15 years. I mean, the main stuff on TV and in books about empire, until people like David Olusoga appeared, and me, was Niall Ferguson, Jeremy Paxman, a very positive view of empire. Only in the last decade or so are you finally getting the viewpoint of the colonized.
And you're right, growing up in the 90s and then noughties, I remember that any dealings with the story of empire on television before the age of social media was overwhelmingly positive and romantic. What, from your experience of the publishing world, of being a journalist, of the media, do you think changed?
Well, I think multiculturalism in Britain is quite old now. well, you could say it's more than 50 years old, like proper mass multiculturalism, if that's a thing. And so the children of people who came over, and we're talking about third or fourth generation, and these people are not embarrassed or apologetic, they're bold and they're really interested in their history. So that has changed. The other thing that's changed is that historians are discovering stuff all the time. And there's an idea that history is a fixed thing, but our understanding of history is always changing. Our understanding of Pompeii, for example, is changing because of the excavations they're doing right now. Our understanding of the Stone Age is changing because of DNA techniques we're discovering. Our understanding of empire is definitely changing very quickly because suddenly historians of a certain generation are interested in it, and finally we're getting another view. And also, a lot of the information that was deliberately repressed by the British state is coming to air, and I find it amazing that, the final Viceroy of India, Mountbatten, his papers are still officially secret. This is the man who was involved in partition. Up to 2 million people died. One of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. And yet his papers are officially secret. It tells you something about the British state. And when you look at the history, in Empireworld, when I looked at the history of Nigeria, I was consistently taken by the fact that even in the 19th century, the people involved in setting up the British Empire were deleting information, or hiding it, or burning it. And so that's taken time for people to catch up on.
What role, whether you're for or against the royal family, I assume that you take a nuanced view to them as you do to most things about the empire. Do you think they can play in helping the country move through and eventually past its history?
I actually think the royal family could be part of the solution. I think they know that, but they're being held back by the government. Actually, I know they know that because I've talked to people involved in the royal family, and they are not culture warriors. They can't be, because they're the head of the Commonwealth, and they're the head of a multicultural society. They have to listen to these, whereas politicians don't, and people on social media don't.
So they feel held back.
I think they definitely want to talk about slavery, their involvement in slavery. I think they would be interested in reparations. I think they'd be interested in apologies, but they're not being allowed to by the politicians. But I think they could be part of the solution in a very clear way when it comes to something like animal conservation. The royal family have been very, very vocal. I mean, Prince William, Harry, Prince Philip, all involved in animal conservation, but very little, almost none, reflection on how the royal family themselves were involved in the destruction of animals during the empire. I mean, they were involved in mass hunting, killing of near extinct species. There's footage, BBC footage, of Prince Philip shooting a tiger in 1961. It would have made his case stronger if he talked about that, because they claim to care our issue. If they talked about the ivory they'd collected during the empire, if they explained that all the beautiful mahogany furniture that decorates the palaces and all sorts of National Trust homes comes from the age of empire, that we felled so many mahogany trees that we nearly made mahogany extinct in the Caribbean. They have the perfect history to be able to talk about this difficult history, but they don't. They don't reflect on it.
You seem to take quite an optimistic view of what would happen if they did talk about it. A lot of people, even those who are most in denial, would say, look, the big danger is that you think that by being open about this, you're purging yourself of the toxicity. You're getting it out there. But that when people now find that you're willing to tell the truth, that truth will be used against you.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm talking to you, I'm saying quite slightly out-of-date things in that the whole conversation slightly changed with Trump and the radicalization and the willingness of people to embrace right-wing narratives. And I imagine if the royal family did anything reproaching any of this, if, for instance, they said, we're going to get rid of all the ivory in our palaces. Prince William actually said that at one point. If he said that now, it'd be woke. It'd be, oh my God, he's gone woke. And the thing is, our press, and I say this as a member of the press in Britain, is incredibly right-wing. So you get propaganda. And the problem is, and you get activism, and they'd be shouted down. But I think what they'd have to say is more in tune with modern Britain than the politicians. And a lot of the people who, rail against people like me and David Oyesoga, and they claim that we hate Britain and they're proud of Britain, it makes no sense because I feel like they hate everything about modern Britain. They want to change it. They hate multiculturalism. They hate immigrants. They hate decolonization. They don't want anything to do with modern Britain. They want to go back to, not even the 19th, they want to go back to 1840.
Exactly, but they don't realise that multiculturalism is like the feedback loop of empire. This is what happens when you have made the world in your image, but you couldn't sustain it, and now you are made in the world's image.
For example, the most vibrant Christian churches in London today, South London especially, are Nigerian churches. Guess who gave them Christianity? We did. And now they're trying to sell Christianity to a British public who aren't interested.
Exactly.
Isn't that really complicated?
I know it is.
That is not black and white.
It's honestly one of my pet peeves, Sathnam, not least because I find myself more and more religious the older I get, is this terrible fact that while there are so many Brits who complain and hate the fact that there are mosques being erected and funded by communities that care, when was the last time they went to church? When was the last time that they honoured their culture at its roots?
Yeah.
And
also the first mosque in Britain, take a guess, it was in the late 1900s? No, late 1800s in Woking. It's hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
And a reflection of our imperial history. But yeah.
I know. Well, you mentioned earlier Virginia Woolf's grandfather, and in this book, you do celebrate several people who were instrumental in the British Empire. You don't just name the villains, but let's talk for a moment about the top 3 heroes and top 3 villains of the British Empire.
But I've had a glass of wine, so I don't want to get the names wrong. Let's talk about James Stephen. Also, I want to make sure they're not all white guys and make out the empire was saved by white guys. Let's talk about James Stephen. So Virginia Woolf's grandfather. He, incredible man, incredibly devout religious man, almost comically so. He once had a cigar, liked it, so therefore he never had another one ever again.
Oh, a Puritan of sorts.
Yeah, Puritan. The only time I think he ever did any work on a Sabbath, only time he ever did, was to sign an anti-abolition bill. He was a very important official, but he worked really hard to introduce the rule of law around the empire. Really hard, tried to make the empire fair for the colonized. But the thing is, the imperialists out there in India didn't want fairness. They didn't. And they wanted to be in charge. They wanted white supremacy. So one man could only achieve so much.
Second.
Probably Eluardo Equinar, probably mispronouncing his name, but, a formerly enslaved man. There's this idea that abolition was something that came out spontaneously out of the goodness of Britain's heart. Actually, it was resisted for decades. When it finally came about, we compensated the slave owners, not the enslaved. And also there's an idea that it was white Britons who came up with it spontaneous, and actually the enslaved were involved, and Eluardo Equiano was a formerly enslaved man who wrote a book about the experience of being enslaved, became a bestseller, and played a major role in convincing the British public that this was an immoral business. I think we're going to struggle to come up with 3.
Would you struggle?
What do you say? 3 villains?
Would you struggle to come up with 3 villains?
That's very easy. General Dyer.
Yeah.
He was the man responsible for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So he's the man. If you watch Gandhi the film, you'll know him as a character. But he turned up in Amritsar at basically a park, assumed that everyone there was political and protesting, and that's the most generous interpretation, and opened fire on a crowd of people, killed about at least 700 people, I think, with a machine gun.
Yeah, the Gandhi film, does that count as a film about British Empire?
Yeah, that does, yeah, probably one of the best ones. Yeah, and a proper bastard, but even at the time, hugely popular in Britain. the right-wing press at the time raised money for him so that he could retire happily, even though the British state realized he was problematic. I mean, Winston Churchill called the massacre monstrous. And then this is Winston Churchill saying this.
Second.
Obviously, people are complicated, but I think you've got to say Winston Churchill.
Interesting choice, because he falls from many people, including historians, between the two.
Opposite things can be true at the same time.
Okay.
He absolutely saved liberal democracy. But even by the standards of his own colleagues at the time, he had horrible views. Look at what he said about the Palestinians.
What did he say about the Palestinians?
Well, I can't quite look up the quote. He basically called them animals and said, they did deserve their demise. Listen to Kavita Puri's amazing podcast series, 3 Million, about the 3 million people who died during World War II in India. And it's just 3 million people who died in India because of policies that Winston Churchill was involved in. He can't be blamed entirely. It's complicated, but he played a role. And 3 million people dying during World War II. And we never think about this. We think about all the people who died. Do you ever think about the 3 million people?
I think about them more than ever. After one particular documentary on World War II I watched quite recently, there's nothing this country loves more than a national treasure playing Winston Churchill in a film that focuses on his struggle to become Winston Churchill. Well, who's your third villain then?
Well, the single worst person I've ever come across is in Empireland, is a guy called Thistlewood. He was a slave owner, tortured, raped. Awful. He's enslaved people. Absolutely awful. But he kept a diary and outlined his sadistic abuse, which is a very powerful record of what happened. Could you imagine then all the other people who did this and there's no records kept? It's a very important document because it explains to you just how evil slavery was.
To end this on a positive note, I'd like to talk about the role that the Commonwealth as it exists today could play in telling a news story and taking an active role as the Anglophone remnant of the empire.
Yeah, the problem with the Commonwealth is that it has no point. And Britain's entire focus seems to be on America. If it was focused more on the Commonwealth, I think we would be a saner nation. We would understand why we were a multicultural nation. We would hear debates about reparations and, repercussions for our history that we don't hear because we're just focused on America. I think we could be a much healthier nation. And I think the Commonwealth could be part of the solution because, these countries are actively talking about why they don't want King Charles as their monarch. They're talking about reparations. They're talking about how they want their artifacts returned from museums. If we engage with them, we'd have a really good sense of ourselves as a good mirror because they are largely a symptom of our empire. That's why the Commonwealth largely exists. But instead we're focused on America, which is also part of the empire. But America is so dysfunctional that it acts like it was never part of the empire, even though it's acting like the new British Empire. It's a head fuck.
At the moment, we are seeing across Europe and certainly in America a very revanchist movement to not just take back control, but really twist the knife. It's not looking good, is it, for the honest, pragmatic and nuanced approach that you want to see?
Yeah, I've got to say, it's not feeling great at the moment, but I do think that this moment is going to result in incredible art and history and activism. I think this is the darkest dawn, the darkest bit, but I think I am optimistic that there'll be a backlash to this and it's going to be powerful. Even during Trump's last presidency is when BLM, Black Lives Matter, was at its height. And they can't ultimately repress truth. And this is what history is, it's truth. And they'll try, but I think ultimately you can't argue with truth.
I also wonder whether or not we'll see a strong movement of right-wing art. But when they do... Well, exactly. I mean, I think Ayn Rand is having a resurgence.
Yeah, definitely. There's a resurgence now, and there's a resurgence in the fascist kind of image, in the short skirts, blonde hair,
Yes.
leather.
Romantic
It's like-
realism.
And a large part of fascism is the image, But look at all the beautiful art, all the best art of the 20th century. It wasn't fascistic art.
Sathnam, it's been a real pleasure to meet you here at Pizza Express and talk about Empireworld, which is a book far more complicated than this conversation has managed, I think, to capture. So, obviously, as with all episodes, I strongly suggest that the listeners go out and buy a copy of this book and its prequel. But this has been great and timely and very enjoyable. Thank you again.
Thank you.